last week about game interaction and how game interactions work. Today, we are going to be talking about interfaces. In other words, the things that facilitate those interactions, how you communicate with a game and how a game communicates with you. We're going to be talking about accessibility in those designs, how to create control schemes that everyone can use, how to create HUDs and menus and feedback that everyone will be able to process and understand, and so forth. We're also going to talk about playtesting, which is pretty much the single most important thing that you can do to make sure you're creating high quality games. That'll be the second half of the lecture, and we'll be talking about some tips specific to GDW and playtesting in the current situation as well. Really packed today, so jumping right into it. Hopefully you guys remember this from last week, the simplified interaction model, where first the player provides some input to a game, the game reacts to that input and something happens, and then the game gives you feedback on what happens. So the example we kept using was you press a button to drink a health potion, internally your hit points go up as a result of drinking that health potion, and then the game reacts by displaying your increased hit points on the HUD in some way, maybe playing an animation or a sound effect on your character that's evocative of the healing process, and so forth. So today we're going to be zeroing in on the first and last steps of that simplified interaction model, namely input and feedback. So first, talking about input, just so that we're all the same page, who can tell me what is input? How do you communicate with a game? What are some of the things you'll do when you're communicating with a game? What are the physical actions you're taking? What are the things in the game that you're interacting with? Pushing buttons, great. Right, so the controls of a game, right? Is there anything else besides pushing buttons and moving joysticks that you're interacting with? So is there ever anything on the screen you're interacting with to convey what you want to do? Menus, exactly. So controls, menus, interactive screens, maybe like an inventory screen or something like that. Matt says motion controls, right? So buttons and analog sticks are not the only forms of control that we have. Sometimes we'll have exotic peripherals that let us control a game in a unique way. Sometimes we'll have gestural control and things like that. From Joshua, touchscreen, exactly. QuickTime events, right? So that's one way that a game will prompt you for input. Some map screens are interactive, being mentioned in chat as well. Brainwaves, yeah, that's some games do let you communicate with brainwaves through special peripherals, like the NeuroSky headset, for example, moving your head in VR, DK bongos, which I assume is now going to be all that is said in the chat for the next 10 minutes, so very well done. But yes, basically every way that you can communicate with a game, whether it's through a physical device like mouse, keyboard, DK bongos, or through a virtual input method like a menu where you're clicking a button that's on the screen. So you're tapping the button on your mouse to tap a button that's on the menu screen. The other stage that we're going to focus on today, apart from how you communicate with a game, is that last stage, feedback, which is how the game communicates with you. So switching gears, what are the different ways that a game can communicate with you? How does it give you information? GUI, from Jordan in chat. Yep, definitely one way. Stephen mentions vibrations, right? Indeed, in a controller or a lot of gamepads have kind of support for vibrations. A phone, technically you could, but the firmware is not usually exposed for that. Audio, yep, from Josephine, that's definitely another way. Michael mentioning a character flashing red when hit, exactly. So kind of visuals in the game's world or on a character. Filling or emptying bars of different things from Isaac, yes, a very common way to represent information on a HUD, indeed. Visual updates, sound, load noises. Not sure if that's load noises or loud noises. Audio and visuals, tells, tips, and tricks. Right, so lots of different things that the game shows to you, whether it's through a GUI like a heads-up display that has your ammo counter and that plethora of bars, or whether it's through the game's world. So maybe a character flashing when they get hit or playing a sound effect or something like that. All of these different ways that a game communicates with you. And all of the things that we've just talked about on both sides of this, so controls and menus and HUD and visual effects and sounds and animation, all of these things kind of fall under this one big nebulous category of interfaces. So an interface is a shared boundary between two entities. So whether that's a player and a game, or a person and another person, or a computer and another computer, an interface is kind of a boundary between those things that allows for the information exchange between those two entities. This is a really general definition. It's kind of hard to understand in a way with a general definition, so we're going to look at some examples of what I mean to understand what interfaces are in games. So interfaces in general, you'll usually hear referred to in the context of how we as humans use computers. And interfaces are what allow us to communicate with computers and allow computers to communicate with each other, and indeed allow us to communicate with each other. Just by virtue of talking to someone, you could argue that language itself is an interface from person to person. The important thing to recognize about interfaces is that they can allow for sending or receiving information, or a combination of both. So when we talk about a HUD sending the player information, for example, or the player using a controller to send information back to the game. So as an example, a mouse sends information to a computer, and then that information is used to move the cursor. Another example, a display receives information from a computer, and that information is used to determine what color each pixel on that display should be. A touchscreen is an example of an interface that goes both ways. So the user sends information via tapping, swiping, pressing buttons, etc. And the interface also receives information by actually displaying that information to the user, figuring out what should be on the screen. Usually when you hear the term interface used, it's in the context of a user interface, aka all the virtual buttons and menus and gadgets that you'll see in a program like Photoshop or in a web browser. The interface is kind of all the interactive elements that let you do things with that piece of software. I'm going to be saying the word interfaces a lot today, so get used to it. The thing about interfaces are that they are what let us communicate with games. And also, they let games communicate with us. Remember that an interface forms a boundary between us and the game, and that interface allows for information to flow across that boundary. So we're not at the point yet where, Elon Musk has put Neuralink chips in everyone and we can just upload The Simpsons Hit and Run directly into our brains and just pass out in our chairs and feel like we're playing. So in the meantime, we need these interfaces to allow us to communicate information with a game and vice versa. So the first type of interface that we're going to talk about is input interfaces, aka how we communicate with games. You might just call this input. Another way you might describe this is player to game interfaces, interfaces that allow the flow of information from a player to a game. So in other words, these are the interfaces that allow us as players to communicate our intent to a game system. So what needs to be communicated will vary depending on the type of interface that you're designing, but in general, this is any of the player's desired actions. So this could be something like moving a character, or using items, or wielding a weapon and swinging a weapon. It could even just be changing settings. So how are you going to actually let players, change the resolution of the game or something like that, and so on and so forth. So how does this work? How do you actually pass information to games? What do you do? What are these interfaces? Well, some of them are physical. So one way is by interacting with a physical device. This is typically the game's controls. So this could be a gamepad, a mouse, a keyboard, Oculus Rift controllers, a touch screen, and so forth. It doesn't have to always just be about a physical device, though. There might also be some virtual interactive element that lets you communicate your intent. So as an example, an interactive menu with buttons that you press on screen to signify your intent, an inventory screen where you can move items around that are in your character's pockets, etc. However, even these virtual elements, these virtual interfaces that have little buttons that you can manipulate and all that sort of thing, they still require you to pass through a physical interface. So for example, clicking on menu buttons with your mouse or tapping on a touch screen, there's still a physical layer involved. Now, these aren't the only ways to input your intent into games. They are the most common. Probably 99% of the interactions that you have on a daily basis with games at all will follow this general format, where you have a physical device that's, a controller or a keyboard and mouse or something like that, and you're interacting with it to either directly signal your intent, i.e. moving a character by moving an analog stick, or with some intermediate interface intermediate virtual interface rather to communicate your intentions. So clicking on a button in a menu. But these are not the only ways to communicate with a game. So let's look at what some of the other options are. One of them is sound. So you don't see this very often, but voice control is an option in games. Even something like, how loud you're breathing or shouting or something like that to actually communicate your intent. It's a creative avenue. It's not something that's generally played with very much, but there's definitely potential there as a designer. And here I distinguish between sound in the context of voice control and sound in the context of, chatting with teammates. That's all well and good, but you're not directly communicating anything to the game when you're using team chat or something like that. You're just communicating with your teammates. You're not actually controlling the game with your voice at all. Haptics is a word that refers to the sense of touch. So if this is the first time you're hearing it, then haptics just means relating to the sense of touch. If you've heard it before, you've probably heard it in the context of haptic feedback, so controller rumble, but haptic input devices are also a thing. So something like grip strength in VR is probably the best consumer level example of that. So if you've ever played a VR game where your grip strength on the controller can actually do something, that's an example of haptic input to a game. Half-Life Alyx, for example, no spoilers, but depending on how hard you're gripping the controller, assuming you're using the Vive controllers or the Index controllers, you can actually crush the cans that you pick up in the environment by grabbing onto the controller. Just an example of that. There's also things like pressure-sensitive styluses. So if you have a pen tablet or you're big into OSU, then you'll probably be familiar with this, where you can actually detect how hard someone is pressing with a stylus, assuming the stylus is equipped for that. Very common in digital art, obviously, but also something that you could use in game design. There's also lots of others. So gestural control for the Connect, which was kind of a fad maybe about 10 years ago and isn't so common now, though gestural control obviously is still a thing in VR, though it doesn't feel as gimmicky as, say, a Wiimote or the old PS Move controllers. Eye tracking is also something that's pretty neat. There's a company called Tobii that makes eye trackers. If you've heard of them before, you might have seen some viral challenges on YouTube where, certain things are on the screen and the person is trying to look in non-suspicious areas to the delight of their viewers. And there's also something called a brain-computer interface that lets you kind of directly communicate with a game based on your brainwaves. So this was mentioned in chat earlier. I'm not sure if it was serious or a joke, but this is in fact a thing. There's a company called NeuroSky that makes headsets that have passive electrodes in them that can pick up whether you are very, very focused or very, very relaxed. And there's a couple little sort of demo games that you can play with those where it's like, oh, neat, it's reading my brainwaves. The tech's not quite there yet for it to be a super satisfying experience, but it is still an interesting design possibility. I actually worked on a BCI game myself when I was in 4th year as a little demo for a class I was working on. There's a lot of potential there. It's kind of tough to work with from a tech perspective because the hardware isn't perfect, but it does present some interesting design challenges. Now, the reason why you don't see these types very much is probably pretty obvious. Not many people have devices that support all of these types of input readily. Many of the devices that exist that do support these types of input, particularly in terms of eye tracking and BCI, aren't fully reliable enough to create a really good user experience. So that's why you don't generally see these used as much. There's just not a market there, and the tech's not just quite there for it to provide a great experience. So us designers stick to what we know and the tech that works, and you see more of the traditional input types being used. So that's it for a brief overview of what's out there for input. We're going to get into what designing good input looks like in a few moments. But before we get to that, I just want to spend a moment to talk about output, or AKA how games communicate with us. So those things we were mentioning earlier about HUDs and sound effects and that sort of thing. Now, just as we described input as being a player to game interface that takes information from a player to a game, we can describe output as a game to player interface. So how the game communicates information and passes it to the player. What needs to be communicated here? Well, remember that with input, we needed to communicate all of the player's intentions to the game. So here, it's basically everything the game needs to tell the player for the player to be able to make a decision about what to do. So this can be things like the status of the character, if there is a character, such as health or ammunition or stamina or something like that. This can be things about the status of the game world, so what the weather's like, what time of day it is, how many people live in city A at this time, and where's the train station, and all this other just random whatever junk applies about your game's world. That's something that you might need to communicate to your players. Progression status is another really important one. So how is the player doing? Give them some feedback on how they're performing in the game. What level are they on? What quests are active? How did they do on their last quest? Are characters happy or upset with them? That type of thing. And also current settings. So, what's the resolution? What are the graphic settings? If a player wants to figure out why their game is running at 3 FPS, are you going to tell them? Or are you going to go, do you have ray tracing turned on? I don't know. You must figure it out. It is a mystery. No, that's something that you have to communicate to players so that they have that information. And obviously, this is not an exhaustive list. Basically, just anything you want your players to know, it has to go through an interface that then communicates that information to a player. So what do some of these interfaces look like? What do they do? Well, there's lots of different sensory channels available. What do I mean by that? People perceive information through our senses: sight, hearing, touch, smell, taste. And all of those channels are potentially ways for a game to give us information. So typically, the most common way that games will pass us information is through sight. So this can involve icons, text, showing information in a world, such as character animation, again, going back to the example that was mentioned earlier of a character flashing red when they get hit, all examples of visual feedback. The other secondary type of really common feedback is auditory feedback, so through hearing or sound. And this can be sound effects like a character screaming out, or, you did it type of check mark sound effect, or oh no, you're dead sound effect. This can be through music. So if music is really calm and tranquil, you can relax a bit. If music is really hepped up, then it's combat music and you're looking around going, oh God, I don't see an enemy. What's about to happen to me? All of these are ways that games pass you information. The other way that is still used in games, though you don't generally see quite as much, that was mentioned earlier, again, haptics. So in the context of output, haptics means passing you information through your sense of touch. And generally speaking, the only common form currently is vibration feedback. So controller rumble, for example. There are other ways to do haptic feedback. Fancy smartwatches, for example, can really feel like they're tapping you through really complex patterns of vibration. If you were in some kind of, mechanical exosuit that could move your arms for you, that would kind of be haptic feedback in a way. Technically, that would be through a sense called proprioception, which we're not going to get into, which is your awareness of where your own body parts are. But in games, apart from sight and hearing, generally speaking, the only other type of feedback that you get today, at least, is through controller vibration. Now, there are other possibilities, obviously, but they aren't technically feasible yet. There is no smell-o-vision for games, as regrettable as that is. There's no taste feedback in games, which honestly might be for the better, but one day, who knows? Just as an aside before we move on, with respect to output in general, I'd like to bring up the concept of diegesis. So who's heard the term diegetic before, or diegesis, or diegetic HUD? Anybody in the chat, have you heard this term before, or are you going, I don't know what this is? Is this Greek or Latin or something? It's Greek, by the way. But the word diegesis refers to the fictional world of a game or any other artistic work, in a movie or a book or something like this. In games and in movies, we usually say that something is diegetic if it exists in the world of that creative work. So something is called diegetic if it exists literally in the game's world. So this is easiest to understand by example. So let's think about sound effects. A character breathing heavily when they're injured is a diegetic sound effect because that sound effect exists in the game's world. If you think about the game's world as its own reality, that character is a real person in that world. Them breathing heavily is a sound effect that that character and other characters in the game's world would be able to hear. That sound effect is occurring in the game's world. It is diegetic. On the other hand, if a character gets injured and you as the player hear a beeping noise which comes from nowhere, it's just a beeping noise to let you know that there's low HP, that's a non-diegetic sound effect. The characters in the game wouldn't be able to hear it unless it's coming from a life support system or something like that that's physically on the character that they'd be able to hear. That's a non-diegetic sound effect. So for example, that beeping that comes in Pokemon when one of your Pokemon has low HP, it's a non-diegetic sound effect. In the other hand, in The Long Dark, for example, when your character's breathing heavily because it's cold outside and they're saying, I need to get inside, that's a diegetic sound effect, since that's something that would actually be heard in the game's world. So most often, the term diegetic is used to refer to sounds or music or GUI elements. That's elements on a game's graphical user interface, so like little icons on the HUD or something like that. If you're interested in this concept in general, Extra Credits has an interesting video on it that will go into more detail than we have time to talk about in the lecture. So just to look at a couple of examples to reinforce what these terms mean. So a non-diegetic UI would be the basic HUD in Fallout 4. So all those green overlay elements, they're not something that your character would be able to see. They're not actually in the world. They don't exist in the world. They're just for your benefit as the player. It doesn't come from a specific source in the game world, so it is non-diegetic. Looking at the same game, an example of diegetic UI would be the HUD that comes on when you're wearing power armor, since it's actually supposed to be rendered as a hologram inside the helmet that the character is wearing. The character would be able to see those things that you're seeing on the screen. Maybe they'd look a little bit different. They'd be projected at a different angle or something, but your character would be able to see that. The Pip-Boy is another example. So it's a device that your character is physically wearing on their hand. If your character was actually staring at their wrist, they'd be able to see what you as the player were doing with the menu. So if you and your character, that's generally the litmus test, would be able to hear or see a particular effect, then that effect is diegetic. If that effect is purely for your benefit as the player and it's not something that comes from inside the game's world, then it's non-diegetic. So a little point of discussion before we move on, and feel free to F in the chat if you've had experience with a UI or sound effects like this and you'd like to share. Does diegesis in games with respect to UI design, does it make you feel more immersed in a game, or does it feel over-designed and distracting to you? And if there's any Dead Space fans here, that's kind of the quintessential example of a diegetic user interface that's usually used. Oh, shoot, my Google Meet chat kind of froze up. Sorry about that. Okay, now I'm down at the bottom here. Let's say who was answering first. I think I've got Ryan first up here. Sorry about that, guys. My chat had frozen up a couple minutes ago and it just scrolled back down. Oh, Ryan says, wait, no, never mind. Okay, Heather?
Yeah, in general, I think most diegetic elements are just, for me, I guess it's more interesting, but I think in many games, I think it's an advantage because it's just, there's more things to keep track of. I don't know, it's hard to explain how I feel about it, but I definitely think it's more immersive. It's not necessarily distracting, and it just really puts you into the seed of like, oh, I am really in this world, and if I want to do something, this is how I check it. And I definitely think I like diegetic UI whenever it pops up, as well as like other examples of diegetic things.
Yeah, great. And that word of kind of immersion and feeling like you're more in the game's world is definitely the primary advantage of diegetic elements compared to non-diegetic elements. Matteo?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I think it's good. Like diegetic UIs are nice in a game where it's like more of like an adventure style and like you're taking in the landscape and things like that. But when it's like a first person like shooter, like fast pace, I like when it's just like a static UI and you're not really like distracted by anything moving or like it's just like on your screen. You don't really need to worry about it unless you're actually looking at it.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. Sometimes diegetic UIs have kind of, you don't want to say over-designed, though sometimes it can feel that way. A lot of the time, some of the artistic choices that are made in terms of how things are animated or displayed, or if there's, a flickering effect on a hologram or something like that, it can get a bit distracting if you're, as the player, trying to parse that information as quickly as possible. So a great point there. Ariana?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so I do agree that diegetics can be pretty great for games there. Though the one downside I feel like nobody ever has talked about yet is timers, like especially in the old Mario or Castlevania games, because I have moments where I'm really immersed in what I'm doing, and then suddenly the music changes or the timer sounds, which usually sounds like an alarm clock, will start to play, and usually I have to scramble to get to the end, which I meant that kind of diegetic can be a bit of a distraction, but at least it gives me a shock though to realize that I'm being timed and all, especially when I forget about that.
Yeah, so there's actually a bit of a distinction to be made there. In the context of the Mario games, for example, the music it's just something that's kind of piped to you as a player. There's no radio in the
Mhm.
game's world or any explanation for how the music would be in the game's world. So I would say that those effects they're non-diegetic. What you're
Okay.
kind of getting at there is kind of the speed at which the information is conveyed to you and the fact that it's via audio as opposed to having some secondary visual indicator, for example, a
Okay.
timer on screen that lets you know
Yeah, I
how
do
much time you have
spot that
left.
timer in a corner there usually, and I sometimes forget it's there.
Yeah, and the idea of conveying information in multiple ways to prevent players from getting confused or sudden changes in information from being alarming to them is actually something we are going to be talking about a bit later in the
Okay.
lecture, a concept called redundant encoding. So you're hitting on something really interesting there, actually kind of getting ahead.
Oh, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, I think we got time for one more before we move on. Josh H.
Yeah, I would have to agree with most of the people who've already spoken. It really depends on the type of game that you're playing, especially um, like if it's a kind of more story-ish based, more like um, take like Warframe for example. There's some diegetic UI there that it like just like is really cool because you're in your spaceship and you're walking around and you're putting all things on your character and you can actually see that and it looks cool.
Yeah.
Because it looks like it's actually in the game and you're a part of the game and it's really immersive. But for certain games, like for say first person shooters, if there's like a whole bunch of stuff just in the corner of your vision and you can't pay attention, it just, yeah, it just is very, very distracting, especially when like somebody's in front of you and you're paying attention to something in the corner of your eye. And then you
Yeah,
just
and that
all of a
points to
sudden,
some. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
and you just all of a sudden get killed just because of that.
Yeah, and that points to not just the question of kind of diegetic versus non-diegetic, but also the placement of elements in general and how
Mm.
you're actually organizing things to say, we're going to make the things that the player really needs to know as easy to look at as possible, which is why sometimes in shooters you'll see some information near your reticle or your crosshair in the middle of the screen. You might see some vital stuff like how many shots you have left or something like that, depending on the game, so that it's easier for you to look at that information without looking away from the action. Another point that I'd make before we move on, which a couple people have hinted at as well, is that it's not always a question of one or the other. Sometimes you'll have menus that are non-diegetic just because it wouldn't make sense to try and work in a diegetic menu into a game where maybe the HUD is diegetic, but how are you going to make all the menus diegetic? Like, is the character going to have this godly hologram headset that just has everything in the game on it? Or are you just going to have some elements that are diegetic and then some that are non-diegetic to make it a bit easier for the player to understand? There's definitely a balance, and when you're working on this type of thing yourself, don't think that you have to limit yourself completely to one or the other. You might have parts of a user interface or sound effects or something like that that are diegetic and others that are non-diegetic. It's kind of about striking the right balance between immersion and making sure that information is as clear and interpretable as possible for players. So just moving on. So some interfaces, before we talk about how to design interface as well, they're not just limited to being a player to game interface or a game to player interface. Some interfaces allow for communication to happen in both directions. So as an example, the inventory screen in Breath of the Wild, or indeed the vast majority of inventory screens, they don't just show you what you have, they also allow you to tell the game, I want to reorganize these items, or I want to equip this item or consume this item. They allow you to convey some information to the game as well as telling you about what you actually have. Another example is a controller. So we think of a controller as an input device, but any controller that has a rumble motor in it is also an output device. It allows the game to, vibrate your hands when you get hurt for the 90th time in Ori of the Blind Forest because you can't escape the damn Ginso tree. And a controller is not just limited to being an input device in that regard. It can also provide you as the player with some information coming from the game. So now that we're all experts on what input interfaces are available, what output interfaces are available, and diegesis, and the fact that we have some interfaces that allow for input and output, how do we actually make good game interfaces? And this is a really complicated question that is obviously a whole course on its own, but that's what we're going to talk about for the next hour or so before we move on to playtesting. So before we talk about making good game interfaces, we are once again very briefly going to dip into the history bucket a little bit. So game interfaces have basically been changing constantly since the 1970s when commercial gaming first became a thing. Physical control devices have become more sophisticated and more specialized to games. Initially, we didn't really know anything about playing games because it was a new hobby. There were not many things that were specifically designed for gaming. They all took inspiration from other things like remote controls at the time, or radios, the other things that people interacted with. So the first arcade cabinets, if you've ever looked at, for example, the original Pong cabinets, the first input devices on arcade cabinets were dials because they mimicked what was available on radios and televisions at the time. Today, controlling, a Pong paddle with a dial seems a little bit ridiculous, but at the time, that's what people were used to. That was the design that informed how arcade cabinets were constructed and how that the input to those games was designed. Today, though, a great deal of hardware exists that's highly specific to gaming. So a lot more of our inspiration in hardware design and interface design comes from the lessons we've learned from years of game design, rather than looking at a radio and going, well, there's a dial on that and it has weird electric waves and stuff, so we're making a video game, we should definitely control it with dials, right? So the physical control devices have evolved to become much more gaming specific, but visual interfaces, aka HUDs and menus and all that other jazz, have changed a great deal as well. So originally, the feedback that you would get in something like an arcade game was little more than a score getting printed on the screen. It was text, it was really simple sprites. Today, you need to manage a lot of information, right? If you're playing a first-person shooter with 100 other people online, it's a battle royale, you don't just need one number on the screen that's telling you your score and that's enough. You need to know where your teammates are. You need to know how much ammunition you have. You need to know how much armor you have. You need to know what weapons are in your current loadout. You need to know what pings your teammates are placing, where the nearest cache stations are to upgrade your weapons, all this other stuff that you need to manage. Just having text on the screen isn't going to cut it anymore. You as the player need to hear the sounds that your enemy's footsteps are making. You need to understand what your teammates are doing. All of this much more complicated information that has to be communicated to you in these much more complicated ways. So the first peripherals that we had during the arcade era, controls were first being developed at this point. So a lot of what we had was dials and really, really clicky old-fashioned push buttons and really primitive joysticks. Simple GUIs for simple games at this point. You didn't have a lot of information to convey. It could be conveyed very simply. When we moved on to the early console era, there was experimentation going on with controller designs. People were getting these devices into their homes for the first time. These were some of the first devices that were being developed specifically for the express purpose of playing games and not being used for anything else. So we saw things like, yes, exactly, Nathaniel in chat, the introduction of the D-pad and the ubiquitous 4-button XYAB design. And for the record, I actually don't know why those 4 letters were chosen. It's something that I, for some reason, haven't looked into yet, but that's what birthed that tradition that's stayed until this day. And in terms of the actual games themselves and how we were developing visual interfaces and that type of thing, games were becoming a lot more complex. We were having our first forays into 3D. Instead of just having a score on screen, you suddenly had things like the level you were on, lives, health, ammo, like you see in the screenshot there, where your enemies are, and you had to understand 3D position. So the way that games were being rendered and animated was all becoming much more complex. Jump forward, 20, 30 years into the modern era, and what do we have today? Well, there's an explosion in peripheral design, right? Everyone and their brother wants to build their own controller, whether it's Valve going, we want to have giant touch pads because that's not going to be awkward with your thumbs, right? Or Google going, we definitely need our own controller just so that we can have a button that lets you tell your Google Assistant that you want to gank noobs for some reason. We're looking not just at designing anymore to say, okay, how are we going to let players move a stick? Because that was the big problem 30 years ago, right? How to make a joystick. Today, it's like, how do we make something that people can comfortably hold and use for hours on end without getting carpal tunnel? How do we make something that is accessible to lots of different people and that everyone with different posture and, different muscular problems and all this kind of stuff is going to be able to use? How do we appeal to everyone? How do we create something that's ergonomic? And in terms of game design, how we're communicating information to players, games have gotten even more complicated, both in terms of kind of technical and visual fidelity and in terms of how many systems there are interacting with games. Interestingly, though, enough, and I think this is a good thing, the past few years in terms of interface design have seen more of a trend towards minimalist UI, so cutting out the amount of information that absolutely needs to be on screen at one time. Most games will have an option for you to turn off or at least minimize a lot of parts of the HUD, just so that you don't need to constantly be staring at 40 different instructions and 13 resources that you don't need right now. So this leads not just to us paring down the information that we're showing to players at any one time, but also coming up with more inventive ways to display information. So instead of having a mini map in the corner that's got a bunch of little obnoxious dots on it saying exactly where all of your enemies are, you might have bleed indicators at the side of the screen in combination with spatial audio, giving you an indication of where damage is coming from without overloading you with all of this information, and while also making the game feel more immersive and realistic. So when you're looking at designing game interfaces today, you have two main tasks, and these tasks are probably not really surprising at all. Your first task is to decide how players are going to pass information to the game, and your second task is to decide how the game is going to pass information to players. And as a bit of background for how you're going to do this well, I'd like to introduce to you something which will crop up again probably, well, maybe not until fourth year, but probably again next year. So this is something called design principles for human-computer interaction. And these are 6 principles originally proposed by Don Norman, who is a researcher in the area of human-computer interaction. You'll often see these referenced in regard to teapots and doors. For some reason, doors come up a lot, but they really, really apply to game design. So bear with me. There are 6 of them, but we're going to talk mainly about the ones that are extra relevant to what we're talking about today. So let's go over those really quickly. The first is visibility. So this is the idea that players need to be able to easily see or sense important information. So what do I mean by this? If you want players to be able to read really important text, don't put it in 6-point font crammed at the bottom of the screen. It should be large and readable and in an area that will grab players' attention and be easy for them to quickly look at and read. Visibility as a term doesn't just apply to visual feedback, though. It can apply to any sense. So sound, for example, if you want a sound effect to be visible, make sure that it is at a volume where players will be able to hear it and that the character of that sound is something that will grab their attention. You could also argue that this applies to haptic feedback. So if you want to give players a bit of a shock with the controller rumble if their character takes a lot of damage, make sure you're really revving up the motors in the controller and not just giving them a light buzz that they might think is from hitting the desk or something like that. The second principle that's extra relevant to what we're going to be talking about is mapping. So the mapping principle is the idea that the position of physical controls relates to their function. So for example, if you're using a game controller, here, I know I've got one right here somewhere. Come on. So if you've got a game controller and you're controlling in an FPS, for example, if your character has 4 main abilities, you'd probably expect them to be on all of these buttons or maybe on the D-pad, depending on what you're doing exactly. You wouldn't expect, for example, one ability to be on pushing in this stick and one ability to be on this trigger and one ability to be over here and one ability to be on the select button for some reason. That doesn't make any sense. The functions are related, so their controls should be grouped together positionally. This also applies to virtual interfaces as well. So, for example, in Spotify, your rewind button is to the left of your pause button, which is to the left of your fast forward button, and so on. The next principle is consistency. So this refers to similarity or conventions between multiple designs. An example is that a game is internally consistent if it uses the same thing in the same ways throughout. So, for example, if you use the color red in the game to represent a health potion, then one would expect your health bar to be red as well. If your health bar is green, but your health potion is red, and your stamina bar is red, but your stamina potion is green, that is bad internal consistency, and you're going to confuse your players. Consistency can refer to external consistency as well. So this means consistency between different games. For example, WASDA is move in pretty much every game since 2002. If you find a game that uses the arrow keys to move as its primary method of locomotion, then that game is not externally consistent. You can read more about the principles on a link that is apparently missing from the slides. I'll put that in on the version that ends up on Canvas later tonight. But if you hit that link for Don Norman there, the principles I believe he has on his website as well. I'll put that link in a bit later. So your first task that we talked about, deciding how players are going to pass information to a game. This essentially comes down to designing a game's controls. So in designing controls, you're basically asking how a player's input is going to map to their actions. What are some tips in general for figuring out what makes a good control scheme versus what makes a bad control scheme? Well, controls should typically be easy to learn, no big surprise there. And probably the biggest way that you can make your controls easy to learn is to respect conventions that exist in how controls are designed, aka WASD to move, shift is sprint, control is crouch, and so forth. So generally speaking, you don't want figuring out your controls to be difficult. Any difficulty that comes from using your controls should be from, executing a difficult combo or timing or something like that. You shouldn't have players going, why is it right stick to move and left stick to rotate the camera in this game when every other game since the beginning of time has been left stick to move and right stick to rotate camera? If running and jumping on its own is tricky, it should be tricky because of speed and timing and hazards, not because you're violating some convention that players expect and they suddenly have to unlearn their muscle memory from every other game. You don't want remembering what to do to be the hard part. You want execution to be the hard part. You don't want players to have difficulty understanding why a button is bound to a certain thing. Sometimes input mastery is part of the challenge. So in fighting games, for example, memorizing a combo might be part of the difficulty, but as a general rule, you want to respect the existing conventions that are out there so that players will have less of a hard time just getting on board with using your controls. So moving on to some general notes on HUD design and passing information to players, where to my mind, there's a lot more variation in your design choices for what goes on. So we're going to spend a bit more time on that. Probably the most common question that you'll be asked as a designer in this category when you're showing someone your GDW game, they're okay, what does your HUD look like? Because that's the primary point of contact for players to see what information is always available to them, right? You convey some information through the world and through music, and all of that is fantastic, and you should definitely do that. It's very immersive. But when it comes down to what your player needs to know at any given moment to make a strategic decision, a lot of it comes down to the HUD. It is the always-on point of contact for showing information to players. The thing about HUDs is they need to be quickly understandable at a glance. So that idea that was brought up earlier when we were talking about having to look away from the action and try and read an ammo bar or something like that and then getting shot. If your HUD's not readable at a glance, that type of thing is going to happen and players are going to become frustrated. So the goal of a HUD is that you need to convey necessary information. Trim out the fat. Don't put on the weather forecast for the next 7 days in your game unless the player absolutely needs to know it. It should be critical information communicated in the clearest way possible. So you really want to ask yourself in looking at your HUD to figure out if it's done well, is everything that players need to play well available to them in the moment? If the answer is yes, you've probably got a serviceable HUD. If the answer is no, then you're either missing some information or maybe players are having difficulty finding that information because they can't get it in the moment and so forth. You need to be really careful about your HUD getting in the way. So this comes back to the concept of layout that we talked about earlier. So for the information that players need, ask yourself if you can show that information contextually, so only when needed. For example, if you're creating an adventure game that has very little combat, do you always need to show the health bar? Probably not. And do you want to constantly clutter up your player's view with a health bar when they couldn't possibly be taking damage? Again, probably not. So maybe choose to only show that when the player is in combat. Another thing that you want to ask yourself, and this is true of controls as well, can you let players customize it? Basically, customization is the holy grail of making sure that your interfaces are designed well. If you're worried that your controls aren't necessarily going to meet the expectations of one player because you're making some weird hybrid fighting game shooter thing and you want to respect the conventions of both, but players will be coming in from different expectations, offer them options. Let players rebind all of the keys that map to the actions that they can take in the game. With respect to the HUD, allow the same type of options. Let players choose to turn off their health bar or their ammo bar or the entire thing if they want to play through a more, cinematic experience, particularly in a single player game. Now, if you've got something like a fast-paced shooter and there's a lot of information that players definitely need all the time, think about how you can let players customize how they receive that information. Can you let them choose from a couple of different layouts? Can you give them a scaling option so that stuff isn't going to be so big that it's completely taking up their view? So HUDs are obviously not the only way of communicating information to players, as we've said. So we're briefly going to take a look at some other methods of feedback as well. AKA, not everything has to be on the HUD. I think the most common thing that we see in HUD design that is a flaw is having too much information on the HUD that is clutter that players just don't need at any one time, and that kind of leads to this perception that parts of the HUD are unnecessary and it's distracting and it's just getting in the way of all the other beautiful stuff you've made for your game, except you've slapped a whole bunch of text and icons over top of it so players can't even appreciate it anymore. So when you're designing your HUD or when you're designing your game's method of communication with players in general, ask yourself if you can show information in a different way. So for example, can you show that information in the game's world? Can you demonstrate that information via sound or via dialogue? For example, if you're playing a single player game and you want to give the player hints about where a bunch of enemies are coming in, can you do that via spatial sound that the player will be able to hear, oh, there's an enemy coming in to my left? Or can you have a player's AI companion shout out, they're coming in from the left or something like that? Something inventive that doesn't require you to just slap information in the player's face. There's multiple reasons for why you should show information in one way. The first, probably most common one, is that it can help prevent unintentional errors, so avoid missing a cue. So if you do something like demonstrating something via sound and dialogue and some kind of particle effect in the world or something like that, then you're giving players multiple ways to interpret that information. It also gives players a choice. So if you have HUD customization options that let the player turn off the HUD, but there's some other sounds or something like that that give the player an indicator, then that can help them customize their experience. So for example, maybe not every player is going to want to see a health bar, but they'll still want some kind of indication of when their character is really low on health. Maybe you can convey that through sound effects or the way the character is animated. You give them a little limp and make them start breathing heavily. Some players might just want to turn off the HUD and rely on that to figure out how they're doing. This can also obviously make players feel more immersed. If you convey information in different ways apart from just shoving it in their face, it can feel like a more realistic and immersive experience. You have to be careful, though, in doing this, not to overwhelm players, obviously. So not showing a whole ton of information in all these ways at once. And, everything's got a particle effect and a sound effect and the music changes and there's an animation and a character tells you something and a text box pops up and it's on the HUD. It's too much. You can't completely overwhelm players with every piece of information that comes in, or you're just going to frustrate them. So what's an example of this done well, this communicating pieces of information in multiple ways? Well, one thing that I would bring up is the long dark. So in the long dark, the HUD is done relatively minimally. You can switch to a contextual toggle for all the different kind of needs that the game has. So in the game, for those that aren't familiar, you have kind of a temperature indicator of how exposed to the elements your character is, a fatigue indicator of how tired your character is, as well as hunger and thirst and hit points and ammunition. But you can kind of customize how all of this is displayed and make it show up contextually, aka you're not going to see your fatigue meter if your character is fully rested. You're only going to see it once fatigue becomes a problem for you. And this kind of helps preserve the immersive sense of you actually being out in the wilderness rather than sitting in front of a computer staring at icons to figure out what you need to press on your keyboard. Most information in the long dark is also reinforced through other cues, bringing us to the concept of conveying information in multiple ways. And as an aside, to go back to what we were talking about with Ariana earlier when she brought up the timers in Mario, this communication of information through kind of multiple sensory channels is referred to as redundant encoding. So there might be lots of ways to communicate a given piece of information. For example, look at health. One way to display health might be through text or icons. So on a HUD, you have a health bar that says you have 60 out of 100 hit points. However, you can also show this via character appearance or animation. So a character stumbling around, or there being bloodstains on their clothing, maybe a flash of red when you get hit, to bring up that example again from earlier. You might also be able to communicate this via sound. So like heartbeats, breathing, a non-diegetic effect that's like a beeping. Probably don't do that one. It usually turns out annoying, but some games do it okay. But this term of redundant encoding actually comes from data visualization. And it's a term that's used when a piece of data or information is communicated in more than one way. So in data visualization, that might mean a graph that uses both color and size to represent the same value. In games, I use the term redundant encoding to basically say you're communicating the same piece of information via multiple representations to give players richer feedback. So having a health bar and showing your character limping and playing a faint heartbeat in the background to let you know that your health is low, giving you multiple ways to monitor that state so that you don't suddenly get caught off guard when you die and think, how was I supposed to notice that my character was getting hurt? I didn't notice it on the HUD. So going back to the same game that I just gave an example from, the long dark, that temperature icon that appears on the HUD, it's a little small. You can't really see it on the screen, unfortunately. There's kind of a little pie wheel that's got a thermometer icon in it that shows your character's current temperature. So if you've been outside for a long time, that need really drops because you're cold and you're getting hypothermia. And if you're sitting near a fire, it goes up because you're warm and you're safe. But this icon on the HUD isn't the only way that temperature is conveyed to the player. There's lots of visual effects in the weather that tells you what's going on in the environment. So snow, trees blowing in the wind, even the color contrast that the game uses between the sky and the elements in the environment kind of changes depending on the weather to let you know how dangerous the current weather is to your character. Another is sound effects. So wind whistling and blowing, your character's breathing and your teeth chattering. And another is your character's dialogue. So in addition to these environmental sound effects, when your character's needs get low, they'll start, their teeth will start chattering and they'll be remarking on their ambient temperature. They'll say, like it's too cold out here. I have to get inside. And they'll kind of start stuttering because they're really cold. And they'll remark on the fact that they're getting really cold and they can't feel their hands and that sort of thing. So all of this information is communicated to you in a lot of ways so that if you happen to, not glance down at your HUD for a while, you won't suddenly get caught off guard and freeze to death because there's been all these other cues, these redundant encodings that let you know what's going on. Now, remember that we said before, any game interface can provide both player-to-game and game-to-player communication. As a designer, to create a good interface, this means that when you're looking at an interface, don't limit yourself to thinking about the fact that it goes one way. So as an example, typically, you'll think about the controller as being a player-to-game interface, an input device. It lets the player communicate their actions to the game. But could you as a designer come up with a creative way to communicate things to the player back through the controller? An example would be HD Rumble on the Nintendo Switch, which is that more fancy haptic feedback that can, make players feel like they're holding a glass that's partially full of water, or really strongly mimic the feel of a particular material rolling across the surface or something like that. As a designer, remember that the interfaces you have available to you aren't always just one way. Another example, usually you'll think of a HUD as just showing information to the player, but could you as a designer find a way to let players use their HUD to communicate with the game? So as an example, those kind of toggleable weapon wheels that have become ubiquitous in shooters these days, particularly console shooters, we think about the HUD as telling us what our ammo or our health is or something like that. But this simple design that works really well is the idea that we can also take the HUD and make it interactive, give players a way to provide input through the HUD to quickly switch their loadout and what weapons they have equipped, rather than just using the HUD as a passive interface. And before we move on, I want to talk a bit about menu designs as well. Obviously, menus being one of those virtual interfaces we talked about, where you kind of have buttons that you're pressing or fields that you're selecting and that type of thing. So menus in general, they're separate from the moment-to-moment interface of a game. You don't, generally speaking, have a menu visible at all times while you're playing. Whereas your HUD is always on and always giving you information, a menu is something you will pull up contextually to do something specific. So typically, large parts of the interface or separate screens you can navigate to, these menus are kind of separate from your main gameplay. You press a key to bring up your inventory or your quest journal or your options menu, etc. So menus are used for many different purposes. Obviously, the most common that you'll probably think of is the main menu of a game, where you're starting the game and configuring options and things like that. But menus are also often used for special actions or management. So things like inventory screens or a quest screen or a menu at a shop that you're using to buy items for your character, something like that. They might also be used to show additional information. So something like a quest log or a character's journal or diary that might log some information that you can just kind of browse through at your own pace. In general, menus should be simple. They should automate any monotonous tasks where possible. The last thing you want is for interacting with a menu in a game to feel like homework. And some examples of this are basically allowing players to, sort items automatically or by different attributes and things like that. So a good example, and I use the term good relatively loosely here because Terraria still does have some very monotonous things with inventory management, but in general, this game does better than a naive implementation because Terraria has a hotbar that you can assign items to that you can then quickly access just by pressing the number keys on your keyboard. And the inventory menu also has a couple of utility buttons on it that will automatically sort your items based on type, and another button that lets you automatically put your items into any storage boxes that you have around the world, and it will stack them into what's already on those boxes. So these types of quality of life features basically automate what is really monotonous and make things easier to work with. It's also pretty easy to understand what's at a glance, what's happening in your inventory at a glance. Everything's visible. It's got counts. It's got icons that are instantly recognizable based on what the item does, and so forth. A bad example of an inventory menu, Skyrim. Skyrim's vanilla inventory is absolute hot garbage. You cannot see everything at once. You can barely see 8 things at once in the default UI. It's got this weird kind of scroll through thing that's okay on a gamepad, I guess, but absolutely terrible when you have access to the input that you do on a PC. You also can't sort anything in Skyrim. In Skyrim's vanilla UI, that is, by anything other than category. So you can view all your weapons, you can view all your apparel, but you can't sort based on weight or damage or value or anything else. And in an RPG where you're a murder hobo in true Elder Scrolls fashion and have picked up approximately 1,000 things and are constantly running around with a full 299 out of 300 carry weight, not being able to see all of your inventory at once or sort it or understand what crap you should be offloading to Bellathor and what you should be keeping in your inventory for later, it's very, very frustrating. So how do we improve on this? Well, the community already did for us. And that improvement is, as I'm sure anyone who plays Skyrim here knows, is called Sky UI. So Sky UI is better than Skyrim's vanilla inventory for a lot of reasons, but here's kind of the basics of why. So more is shown on the screen at once without sacrificing visibility. More information, more visible information, good design. Remember the design principle of visibility. There's also lots of organization capabilities here. So you can organize by type and weight and value. You can filter everything, or you can filter by category. The big thing I want to point out here is that SkyUI's design looks like a file browser. It's something that users are familiar with rather than some esoteric scrolling unsorted list like the vanilla UI. It's something that users will have seen before, and it reflects the expectations that you will have from something like Windows Explorer or Max Finder. And this is external consistency, to go back to those design principles that we talked about earlier. This UI is externally consistent with a file browser. It is something that users intuitively know how to use because they have seen many of these conventions before. So how do we wrap all of this up into general tips for designing interfaces? Well, keep things as simple as reasonably possible. That's the first thing that I would say. So yes, you can obfuscate your UI to comedic effect if you want to suddenly put a bunch of things on screen with no apparent context, like the fake dating sim UI in Undertale that comes up at one point. And yes, your HUD can be more complex than just having plain text and material design minimalist icons that look straight off the Android App Store. You don't have to be boring, but just make sure that your GUI is easily understood, and make sure that your controls are easily understood. Don't map jump to a combo of left on the analog stick and then pressing 2 buttons and then holding the trigger at like half of its total depression value for 1 second before your character will lift off the ground, because players just aren't going to understand what's going on. You won't be consistent, you won't be understandable. Give players some choice over how they interact. So let them rebind keys, let them invert their camera axes, let them selectively hide information off the HUD, and so forth. Also convey information in multiple ways. So give players choices in terms of how they actually want to interpret information. Convey information both through sound and visually. Give some haptic feedback. Give players lots of ways to understand what is going on. Use conventions established by other games as a starting point. This is a big one, especially when you're starting out. A lot of these conventions exist for a reason. They're not all fantastic, but some of them are good. Use your judgment. Know that WASD is a very comfortable position for the vast majority of players to use for moving a character. And for those players for whom it's not comfortable, that's why you provide a key binding option. So players will get used to your game faster and be able to appreciate the specifics of your design, your art style, the systems you've lovingly worked into your game's design, if you can take advantage of their expectations and reduce that confusion in the early experience. The next one, test as early and often as you can. I sound like a broken record when I say this, I know, and we will talk about how to test specifically, the methods that you use, and the playtesting processes that are used in the industry in the last half of this lecture. So before we move on to that last half of this lecture, I want to take a moment to talk about accessibility, which is a sadly under-discussed concept in game design. It is something you will be discussing even more with James next semester, but I would really like to at least provide a kind of brief intro to this before we move on. So question for everyone in the chat. Who do you want to play your game? Who do you want to play your game in general? Maybe the GDW game that you're making, or your passion project. Maybe everyone. Lots of everyone's in the chat. Excellent. Everyone, all the peeps, gamers, Joe Nuts, no one. Oh, that's sad, Jordan. The boys, yeah, at 2 a.m. when they're looking for beans. So the real question is, do you want everyone to be able to play your game? Is there anyone here who wants someone to be locked out of playing their game because they have some special need or requirement? Okay, so some interesting responses that I think are sarcastic in terms of the paywall and the yeses. EA does, oof. Can't be having little kids. Well, the idea of kind of locking out, little kids because there's a lot of violence or sexual content or something like that is a separate issue. But really here the question is, do you want someone to not be able to play your game just because they have impaired color vision, or they have like a muscular issue in one of their hands or something like that? Exactly. You don't want to lock people out of playing your game just because they have some different accessibility need, right? And that's why accessibility is important. It's overlooked a lot of the time in game design God knows why. Thankfully, we're getting better at it. There's sometimes this notion that, only a small percentage of the population. No, it's a lot of people. And hell, it wouldn't matter if it wasn't. We should be inclusive with our games. We want everyone to be able to play our games. And accessibility issues are really, really prevalent in the population. We don't want to be locking out a significant proportion of people from having fun just because we can't be bothered to design something that's inclusive. And that's why accessibility is important. So, talking about accessibility concerns in general, you should never assume that all of your players have the same needs. Not everyone is the same. People are, I don't want to use the word snowflake because of all the negative connotations that has on Twitter, but everyone is different. Everyone has different needs. Players can have conditions that affect different stages of that player interaction process that we talked about, kind of processing information, making decisions, making input, and so forth. So remember from earlier lectures and earlier today that when we talk about the game interaction model, parts of that model are about how players process information from the game. So what they're seeing, what they're hearing, how they make a decision, how they take that information and actually figure out what to do, and providing input to the game. So interacting with a controller or a mouse and keyboard, and so forth. There are three main categories of accessibility concerns that we'll talk about as a result. So one is sensory, such as a visual or a hearing impairment. One is physical, like missing limbs, poor muscle control, things like that. And one is mental or neurological, so things like attention deficit disorder, dyslexia, which kind of also affects sensory processing to a degree, etc. So the first one that we will talk about, the first kind of category of needs, is the idea of sensory impairment. So sensory impairments affect someone's ability to process information. Not all players are going to be able to perceive the feedback in your game as you intend them to. So players with a visual impairment, for example, might not be able to see as well in general. There might be parts of the field of vision that are missing. There might be missing aspects of color vision. So maybe players have trouble discerning between red and green, for instance, which is why you should never rely on color alone to convey information, something we'll look at in a moment. It can also be difficult for players with a visual impairment to kind of see or understand your HUD depending on how it's designed. And this is another case for accessibility options and customization options in the HUD, like UI scaling. If a player has a general visual impairment, they might not be able to read really small text on the screen. Just having an option to scale up that text or improve its contrast can make the difference for someone with a visual impairment from not being able to play your game at all to being able to play it with no problems. Most games are completely inaccessible to the blind, which is really, really unfortunate. Last of Us 2 is a game that's kind of been held up recently as a game that's accessible to pretty much anyone, with lots of settings that kind of change the way input is handled, the way things are displayed, to be at the point where it's accessible, maybe not to someone who has complete and total vision loss, but as someone who is legally blind and can, very slightly discern shapes and colors and that type of thing. Naughty Dog is famous for having these great options. So it's something that I would definitely look at as kind of a really good example of accessibility in games, particularly for visual impairments. So for hearing impairments, obviously you can think about it like the same way you would for a visual impairment, except it's going to affect the way players can process sound effects. It can make it difficult or impossible for players to use music or sound effects as cues to convey information. Again, another case for redundant encoding. If you have a player with a visual impairment and you can convey some additional information through sound, that will be able to help them still enjoy your game. If you have a player who has a hearing impairment or is potentially completely deaf, then you shouldn't be relying entirely on sound effects to convey information. And in general, for something like a rhythm game, this can be difficult, but having settings that allow players to have that information displayed in another way. So for example, anytime there's a sound effect, displaying some kind of icon on the screen in the direction that effect came from could make a game more accessible to someone with a hearing impairment. So just to talk about the idea of color vision impairment for a moment, I'd like to bring up this, which is a custom color scheme for an Elite Dangerous HUD. Is anyone here, out of curiosity, does anyone here have a color vision impairment? If they'd be willing to share that, anyone? Okay, Great. Well, I mean, not great, but it's always interesting. Color vision impairment is actually pretty common. Usually out of a group of 100 people, you'll probably find 4 or 5 people that have some kind of color vision impairment. So question for those of you that have color vision impairment, and depending on the type of color vision impairment that you have, the answer to this might be yes or no. Can you see any difference between what's on screen right now and what's on screen right now? Did it look like it changed significantly to you? Is there anyone in chat who it didn't look like it changed to? Okay, great. So we're seeing it here. Christian, Kieran say that it didn't really change at all. Hyther says it changed a little bit. So for anyone that has normal color vision, there is a huge difference between this image that's on screen right now and this image that's on screen right now. For anyone that has color vision impairment, these two images look nearly the same depending on the type of impairment that you have. The reason why is that this first one that I've just switched back to, this is in red and green, and common color vision impairments, usually the most common types, reduce your ability to discriminate between red and green. They kind of leave everything looking like various shades of yellow. Now, the reason why this is terrible is because in this user interface, red is kind of used as an indication of negative things, and green is used as an indication of positive things. There is no other way to discern those differences other than color. So for someone with a color vision impairment, looking at this screen, the red things wouldn't pop out to them. It would look like this image that I've just flipped over to, which would look like all these shades of yellow. And this is probably pretty frustrating to look at if you have color vision impairment. It's just a case of this is a terrible, terrible design. It's inaccessible. Probably about 5% of the population is going to look at this UI and go, I have no idea what's going on. I can read all of this, but nothing's going to jump out to me. So in other words, the long and the short of this particular lesson here is never use color as the only way that you're communicating information. And in particular, don't use a red-green color scheme to indicate good versus bad or health versus stamina or something like that. It's okay if you want to use that as a secondary cue in addition to text and shape and other things like that, because for people that do have normal color vision, that cue can be helpful. But to be accessible, you really don't want to rely on this alone. Otherwise, you're going to send a lot of potential players throwing their hands up in the air and going, this isn't accessible to me, or at the very least, it's really frustrating to interact with. So something we can maybe talk about at the break, because I think the idea of these types of things is pretty cool. But moving on to our other types of impairments, before we get to that, the second type that we'll talk about is a physical impairment. So this can affect the player's ability to perform certain input actions. Not all players are going to be able to use both of their hands or button mash or things like that. A player's reaction time might be affected by things like a musculoskeletal impairment. So games that are really reliant on twitchy gameplay without configuration difficulty or accessibility options may be accessible to those with a physical impairment. For example, not being able to perform the button mashing type of quick time events is pretty common. I have a friend who has a trigger finger actually that can't do quick time events without being put in extreme pain. So having an accessibility option that switches those types of events to holding a button as opposed to mashing a button is a really important accessibility feature, which is thankfully becoming a lot more common. Special devices can help overcome really extreme difficulties, and these are usually something that you as the designer won't be explicitly planning for, just something to understand that they exist. So for example, eye trackers to move a mouse for someone who has an impairment that doesn't allow them to manipulate a mouse easily with their hands, or a one-handed controller for a player that might not be able to use both of their hands, and things like that. So an eye tracker, for example, and there's a link here to Toby's website where you can look at some more of those, allows a user to move a cursor by looking around and kind of interact or click via blinking, which is pretty cool. The last type of impairment we'll talk about is a neurological impairment or condition that could affect the player's ability to process information or make decisions. So this can lead to several difficulties. This could be trouble learning the game if you have something like a short-term memory impairment. This could be trouble understanding options, even something like dyslexia that makes it more difficult for players to read. If you've got lots of blocks of text in your options and things like that, it might be a lot more difficult for a player with dyslexia to parse all of that. Likewise, if you have a really text-heavy tutorial, someone with dyslexia is going to have more trouble getting through that. And if you have timed prompts because you think, well, you know, all my players are going to be able to read this really quickly, That's not always the case, and you need to account for that when you're designing your games. This could also be trouble remembering or processing lots of information at once, could be trouble making decisions for neurological impairments that kind of affect attention or really severe anxiety or things like that. You might be able to mitigate some of these issues using game options, things like turning on an unlimited time mode to give players a lot of time to make strategic decisions, making sure that you're giving players as much time as they need to read any text that's on screen before it moves on if they have trouble kind of processing written text, removing time pressure in general, leaving tutorial prompts on persistently to remind players of what's going on. Those are all other issues that you can, those are all other options rather that you can include to help mitigate those issues as well. All of this kind of leads back to the idea of what is referred to as empathetic design sometimes. So the idea here is that you as a designer are empathetic with your users. You are aware of their needs. You can put yourself in their shoes and make sure that you're accounting for what they might need when they're playing your game. There's an interesting video linked here on accessibility done really well. If you're interested in this topic, I recommend watching it. One way to check accessibility, I think, really effectively is to simulate someone else's experience. So ideally, you want to find people to test your game that have different needs so that you can actually get their perspective on what is going on in your game. Obviously, now you're not, as an indie developer, this isn't always going to be feasible at absolutely every stage of development. If you're making your game accessible to the hearing impaired, you will definitely want to get some testers that have hearing impairments, but you're not going to be able to rely on those testers at absolutely every stage of the development process. So, as an example, play your game with sound off and make sure that you can still play it and understand all of the information that you need, so that if someone with a hearing impairment was playing, even if they couldn't hear any of the sound effects that you've put in, your game would still be accessible to them. Try playing your game one-handed. See if it's possible to reach all of your inputs, or if you can make a one-handed control mode that you'll be able to play like that. Look at your HUD through a color blindness simulator. So there are some websites that allow you to upload an image and see the image as if you are someone with a particular type of color vision deficiency. Photoshop has proofing modes for different color vision impairments as well. And obviously, the most important point here, recruit playtesters with diverse needs. Actually hear from people that have different accessibility needs to make sure you're being as inclusive as possible. There'll be a lot more about accessibility covered in your game design course with James next semester, or as I prefer to call it, Jame Design. But hopefully this has provided a little bit of an intro to that just to get you thinking. So we'll come back to talk about playtesting at 6:35. The second half of the lecture will be shorter, but if you want to stretch your legs or get some water, now would be the time. And yeah, just to go back, if anyone in chat wants to share about, their experiences with accessibility in games or anything we've been talking about, anyone's got some more stuff about diegetic HUDs or anything like that, then feel free. Jonah?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello? Okay, sick. It didn't work last time, so I'm glad I got it fixed. Anyway,
Oh, no worries.
I don't have a permanent accessibility or disability issue, but over the course of the summer, I was studying calligraphy really hard. So I had to handwrite tiny Chinese characters like 3 hours a day, every day for 4 months. And I ended up getting a repetitive stress injury in my wrist.
Oh, yeah.
And I pretty much couldn't use my hand. Like I had a big old brace on it for 2 months. And almost every game I play, I incorporate, it was in my right hand, so my mouse hand, and almost every game I play used a mouse, and I use an MMO mouse, so I usually bind a lot of stuff to that hand. So being able to not play games or like hold a mouse because my hand would just feel like it's on fire, being able to not use or like stress my hand in any way gave me like so much perspective to what it's like for people that have it as a permanent issue or have a similar type of permanent issue. And oh my God, it made me value like how privileged I am to have these precious, precious hands.
Yeah. No, having that kind of experience really does put things in perspective and will honestly hopefully make you a better designer in terms of accessibility. And to answer the question in chat, we are actually on a break right now. It's just anyone that has anything they want to share during the break, then we can talk about that now. Nathaniel?
Yeah, I was thinking about diegetic elements and elements that you wouldn't normally expect to be diegetic in games. And one of them that I was thinking about a lot is save games. And at first I was thinking about Metal Gear Solid 1. In that game, you have to call Mei Ling by your codec, and she records your progress in like a database that exists in the game's world, which I always thought was really cool. And I thought when I was playing the game for the first time, I was like, oh no, because there's tensions get high in the game, and you're thinking, what if Mei Ling turns against me and I can't save my game anymore?
Yeah.
And then I actually remembered in Undertale, spoiler alert for people who haven't played it yet, you actually, towards the end of the game, you have situations where saving the game, which is also a diegetic thing in Undertale, it actually exists. You got determination and all of that. That actually gets taken away from you, and like the save game ends up in someone else's hands, which, I don't know, I think it's really cool to take elements that are not normally diegetic at all and make them exist in the game world.
Yeah, and that's kind of the idea of fourth wall breaking in general, right? Kind of making what normally couldn't possibly be diegetic. The idea of saving a game, or the fact that your console exists, or the fact that it's running inside an application, and making those things diegetic, making them something the characters are aware of, really leads to really interesting design decisions. And obviously that's true in Undertale as well, or Doki Doki Literature Club is another example where the game actually, you know, turns itself off at some point, or modifies itself or its files in some way, and the characters in the game are cognizant of that, can be used to create some really interesting narrative devices, especially. I think there was another one up here from Miles.
Yeah, hello?
Yep.
Sorry, just a quick off-topic question about the design log. I was reviewing the rubric, and it said the whole thing is worth 15%, right? But the part 1 is 5% and part 2 is 10%. Is there any reason for that? Because
the idea there is that for the first design log, in case you're kind of confused about what to do, or you mess it up a little bit, the idea is that throughout the semester you'll have learned more, so your second submission will be better because of that. So it's worth more because of that.
Oh, okay. So you like get feedback on your first one, and then you get better for the second one?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So that's not to say that you can't get 100 on the first one, obviously, but generally speaking, the quality of any design log or learning journal type assignment is usually better on the second time around. So that one's worth more as just kind of a be nice type of thing. Mohit, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just had a question regarding the references page. So do you just need a link of like the image that we use, like for any like activity or tutorial, for example?
For the activities, I'll basically assume that you're taking the images off of Google Images or whatever, unless you state otherwise, because the activities, generally speaking, are so quick that I'm not expecting you to have time to make your own stuff. For an assignment, then I would say just URLs underneath or at the end in a reference page. However you want to do it is perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you.
Format does not matter. Ariana?
So with this, the design log, do we have to have visual elements in all of them, or does it have to be a text or a mix?
Oh, sorry, you cut out there a bit. Were you asking if there have to be visuals in all of the design logs?
Yeah, like all the entries.
It's up to you. I'd probably say you should have in your complete document with all 4 of them, you probably should have a couple of visuals at some point. But if some entries are purely text, that's perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Each of the design logs can be about different games, right?
Yes, and they should be. Like they should be about different concepts. So I would say the perfect design log wouldn't just be about critiquing commercial games. It would be a balance of talking about some commercial games, some of your own ideas, some stuff from GDW, some stuff that's maybe like your idea for improving a commercial game or a sequel or DLC or something like that. Like have a balance of a lot of different things to kind of round out your subject matter. That's how you'll be able to score full points in the depth category. And Sivanesh, I'm getting kind of scared. I don't know what agreement you're talking about in chat. I'm going to need you to refresh my memory on that. Sorry, Ariana?
So could we include our could we potentially include the critique we did as one of the first assignments, or should we do a different critique?
I mean, you could talk a bit more about that game, but you definitely shouldn't be kind of copying in anything that you've already said for for a different assignment.
Yeah, like obviously, I guess I'd have to use a different Castlevania game if I still want to, like if I like do Symphony of the Night or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, rather than a 4.
Yeah. Jonah just asked in chat in our design log, can we talk about certain concepts surrounding games like monetization, streaming rather than individual games themselves? Yeah, sure. Sure. Basically anything related to game design is good. Stivanesh has to do a face reveal. Okay, interesting.
I
Josh?
also have a quick question.
Yeah.
So for one of the design logs, could you per se like say a character that should be in the game but isn't?
Yeah. And if this is going to be a pitch for a new Smash character, then I'm gung ho.
Waluigi. This is why
I agree.
Henry Stickmin.
Henry Stickmin too, but like Waluigi is what we need to go for first.
Skeleton in Smash.
Sans in Smash.
Rayman.
So Sivanesh has just reminded us that there's going to be a face reveal this week. So you're indeed going to have to follow through on that at the end of class because you've reminded me of that now. So we can all look forward to that. Papyrus for Smash. We need them both. That's the real play.
Even if Minecraft too lazy to come up with his own move.
All the skeletons in Smash. We need Sans, Papyrus, Minecraft skeleton, the Doot skeleton with the trumpet. That guy needs to be in Smash. I'm pretty sure he's just ahead, but we don't worry about that. Skeletor, yeah, another great example. Jeffrey Peterson from the Craig Ferguson Show needs to be in Smash. All the skeletons.
Calavera.
And Dry Bones. I don't think Dry Bones is in Smash already. Is he?
They need me in Smash.
And Mateo. Mateo needs to be in Smash as well. And Sivanesh. That's how you should do your face reveal.
I think we need Isaac in Smash.
Let's just put the whole class in Smash and call it at that. Or we could have, Ontario Tech student, and then all of us can just be different skins.
Which Isaac though? The Isaac here or the Isaac from Binding of Isaac?
No, everyone called Isaac needs to be in the game. Just every person on Earth whose name is Isaac and every character. Okay, so we're at 6:35 now. We still got a bit to get through before the end in the exercise. So moving on to playtesting, I would like to pose a question to you. How do you know if your game is any good? Is it because the programmer likes it? Do you ask your mom if she likes it? Do you cross your fingers and wait for the Steam reviews to come out and then see them overwhelmingly negative and, cry and throw your PC off your balcony? Actually, though, like how do you figure it out? Playtesters, right, exactly. Play the game with the boys, right, because you said the boys are the audience you want for your game, yes? The Steam one, very good. Professor Shepard will say that it's his favorite game. Okay, so question for you all. Have you ever had this thought while playing a game? How could they not have tested this? Or maybe, wow, they must have had to test this a lot. Yes, all the time. Feel free to type any examples you have in chat. Anything Blizzard releases, excellent point. I assume you're talking about balance in particular. Sometimes the balancing choices, in Overwatch or Hearthstone, just wait until Bridget comes to Hearthstone. That'll be a fun day. Bethesda. Yeah, Bethesda in particular, lacking a type of testing called QA testing, which we will be talking about in a moment. PvP scaling, balancing, yes. Point is, we've all been playing a game and thought, how did this make it through? How did this not get tested? Or maybe you've played a game and you were going through a section of it that felt absolutely masterful and you thought, they must have tested this a lot. This feels really good. I had a lot of those moments when I was playing through Celeste, an indie platformer, which I bring up far too much, but have been trying to dial back my references to this year, where a lot of these sections of that game just feel like the challenge is so beautifully balanced that it must have been play tested to hell before it was released. So testing your game in general. There are two main testing approaches, two main types of testing that are done. One type is quality assurance testing, or QA testing, also referred to as bug testing or quality control. They all mean the same thing. This is checking for bugs and technical glitches. The second type of testing is playtesting. So playtesting is checking whether a game's experience works as intended. You'll also hear this referred to as kind of user experience testing. Both types of testing are very, very important, but they are not the same. So checking your game for bugs is not the same thing as playtesting, and playtesting is not the same thing as kind of really intensive quality assurance testing. And yes, this is Subnautica in my background to answer the question in chat. So QA testing, we're going to briefly talk about, because in this course and all your design courses, you will kind of be more focused on play testing. QA testing is more of kind of a programmer problem than a designer problem. So QA testing is making your game more technically polished. This is identifying bugs, glitches, unintended behavior, aka the thing that Bethesda does not do. And obviously with QA testing, you want to test early and often, just like every other type of testing. You want to make sure you test absolutely everything in your game, especially after a new feature or update. The last thing you want to do is to push what you think is a tiny update to the level design, and then suddenly all of your players are falling through the map when they come within 50 meters of a certain trash can. QA testing can be done internally by your team. Usually on a large team, there will be a whole horde of QA testers who are dedicated to finding bugs in the game. They know the game inside and out. They know where the game's kind of pressure points are to put pressure on the game and try and break it and that sort of thing. But in your GDW teams, you don't need to have outsiders to recognize a bug. As long as you're being honest with yourselves, you can look and go, that's not supposed to happen. This is definitely broken. We need to figure out how to fix this. You need to play when you're QA testing to break the game. You're not trying to have a good time. You're not trying to mimic the ideal player experience. That can be kind of helpful if you're trying to figure out when bugs are going to be most common. But generally speaking, you want to try and break the game. You want to try and go out of bounds. You want to try and break the system. You want to try and cause a collision error or something like that. And yes, to answer the question in the chat, in the context of testing, QA stands for quality assurance. So in general, you should never say it's not a bug, it's a feature. Bethesda mottos aside, if something is a bug, it has to be fixed. So an example of a QA test is playing through a game and checking that all characters recite the correct dialogue, that nothing is being played incorrectly, that characters aren't saying the same word over and over again, that conversations are able to progress. That's an example of something you might look at in a QA test. The second type of testing is playtesting. So getting players to play your game and getting feedback on the quality of your game before it's finished. So it is always, always, always better to fix issues before launch. And this doesn't just mean saving everything for the day one patch. It means that very, very, very early on, you want to figure out what's wrong with your game in the context of how people experience it. Are there issues in understanding? Are there issues with likability? That type of thing. Playtesting is really important because it's a way to improve your game's design. It's not about technical polish and fixing bugs. It's about making your game into something better. So whereas QA, quality assurance, identifies tech issues, playtesting identifies design issues with your game that harm its experience as a whole. Again, test early and often, resources permitting. The reason I have this resources permitting flag here is because playtesting, as we will see in a moment, is generally speaking more expensive and more labor intensive to do than bug testing or QA testing. So this can be difficult when you're on your own. And when I say on your own, I mean in a small team like a GDW team, or if you're, a one-person show kind of making your own indie game. But that doesn't change the fact that playtesting is really important for any project, regardless of size. For a game jam game, you might not be able to playtest at all. If you can, that's great. But if it's any kind of long-term project at all, playtesting is crucial. So an example of a playtest would be bringing in outside players to play through your game and asking them about the difficulty of each level to see if there's issues with challenge and that sort of thing. So with playtesting in general, we can further subdivide it into two main types of concerns or issues that you'll be identifying. The first is usability. So usability asks the question, can people play your game? Are people able to understand what they're supposed to do and execute those actions effectively? So Do players understand what actions are available to them? Do they understand what they need to do at any given time or what they're supposed to do? And can they perform the required actions? Do they understand which buttons they need to press, and are they able to actually press them without going, this is impossible, the timing is terrible, or something like that? Usually you can answer usability questions with just a few people. You bring in someone who's never seen your game before, and if your tutorial sucks, believe me, you will figure it out even if you only have a couple people come and play your game. The second type of concern is user opinions. So this is the much more nebulous question of, do people like your game? Do they think it's fun? Do they like the characters? Do they like the art? Do they like the story? Generally speaking, with user opinion questions, you need more people to answer them reliably. You might get really lucky with the first couple of people that see your game and they love your art style and they love your characters, whereas everyone else kind of feels like your art style is a bit of a disconnect and your characters don't really jive with them and they don't really like the main mechanics, but there's this one mini game that they really like. You're not going to figure that kind of stuff out until you have a large group of people, just because these questions are so much more subjective. So an example of what I mean by these two different categories of usability and opinion that's a bit more concrete. An example usability problem might be that people don't understand how to use the inventory menu. Maybe it's too complicated, maybe the layout is weird, maybe they don't understand what some of the functions are. It's something that interferes with their ability to use the game. It fundamentally gets in the way of them having the intended experience. An example opinion problem would be that people universally dislike a character who was meant to be popular. Maybe you want Duke Nukem in a game to be something that, you know, people just love Duke Nukem. Everyone wants to be Duke Nukem, but in this iteration of the game, I think this version was just called Duke Nukem 3D, actually. A lot of people really just didn't like Duke Nukem, and that was a problem. Excellent example in the chat from Ethan, Jar Jar, a character that is supposed to be liked and cute, but who most people can't stand. That's an opinion problem. Isaac, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yes, because I'm obligated to, now that I know this fact, that the guy that voiced Duke Nukem for like the entirety of it is the same voice actor who voices Big the Cat from Sonic the Hedgehog, the giant purple dumb guy who can't find his frog. There's some beautiful juxtaposition there.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking to see who voiced who, and you go, oh, that was that guy. Like, you know, J.K. Simmons, for example, the crazy music teacher from Whiplash, is also Cave Johnson from Portal 2. It's kind of always interesting to see how voice actors overlap like that. So, question for all of you: who should play test your game? Just in chat, who do you think should play test your game? Other than J.K. Simmons, humans, your mom, random people, different people, the designated audience. Excellent, Ricardo. Yes, excellent. The designated audience. Again, Jonah, your target audience, a variety of people of the age group you're targeting. Great, excellent answers. So I'm so sorry, Ricardo. The spoiler alert here is that it shouldn't be you or your team. While you can find bugs in your own game, you really can't be objective about your game's design. You cannot say, this character is definitely likable because, you know, we think he's cute, so he's awesome. Or people are obviously going to be able to understand this because it's so clear. Our game is so easy. You've been staring at it for 3 months. Of course you think it's easy to understand. Okay, so I don't know why my clicker keeps dying. I'm sorry. So playtesters, as we say in chat, should represent your target audience. They should represent your target audience in terms of age, personality, game preferences, the experience they have on a particular platform or with a particular genre of games, and so on. Ideally, you want your playtesters to not have any experience in developing games themselves. Why? Because a playtester who has game dev experience will get caught up in trying to give you really specific suggestions, or they'll go, hey, how did you implement the physics for this thing? This seems really cool. Are you using a spring constraint on this? Because this is really neat. How did you do that? Game devs are going to ask you that type of thing, and it could get in the way of the test. A lot of the time, if you sign up to be a playtester for a company, they will ask you a question about if you have experience developing games. And then if you say yes, they will use that to filter you out of their database and blacklist you from playtesting anything ever, because you're a game dev and you can't really be objective or serve the purpose of a playtest well. Developers and designers play differently than normal people, and they'll likely know too much going in. So for your purposes, though, in GDW, your classmates can be a great resource. It's really difficult to find playtesters. We get it. You're in university. You're under the gun. Being able to find, 6 random people at a moment's notice that aren't game devs can be a little bit difficult. So looking to your classmates for the purposes of GDW can be a great idea. Most importantly, though, this is really the only absolutely key rule I would say that as a first year you really have to follow, is that playtesters cannot be members of the development team. It cannot be people who are directly involved with the development of the game. You can try to play your game and pretend you're a user, and indeed this idea of expert evaluation is something that can be done in testing games, but this takes a lot of practice, and it is not a substitute for testing with outsiders. It is kind of a last-ditch supplement that you can try and look at your game through the lens of someone who hasn't seen it before and identify issues, but it is not a substitute for testing with quote-unquote real playtesters. So how do you get these real playtesters? Well, typically, participation is incentivized with a small reward, can be cash, can be food, can be a gift card, things like that. Typical methods used in the industry, you have some internally organized database of volunteers or email lists. People sign up because they're interested and because you offer them an Amazon card or a free copy of the game when it launches or something like that for participating. Sometimes in the industry, you'll also pay for help from external consultants or cloud services. I've worked on some of those projects as an external consultant before. It's pretty cool. If you're a really small studio or kind of a small mid-sized studio that doesn't have an internal department for playtesting, this is oftentimes what you will do. For you in GDW, ask your classmates and your friends and family. Yes, generally speaking, you don't want to have that kind of conflict of interest, but as a student, probably right now, when everyone's in lockdown, your best course of action is testing over Discord with your classmates or asking your roommate if they will please have a look at your game for a school project. If a classmate is a playtester for you, volunteer to be a playtester for them. I scratch your back. Well, that's not really social distancing. I guess the best way to put this would be one hand washes the other. There is an appropriate and safe metaphor for the current times. Volunteer for each other, help each other out in terms of playtesting. That's something we'll actually be looking at in a tutorial activity. Normally, if this was normal, offer some free pizza or sweets or something like that. Right now, I'd say probably just the incentivization would be that you're trading back and forth. You help them test their game, they help you test your game, and everybody's happy. So when should you be playtesting once you know who you can get? When's a good time to test? Can anyone in the chat tell me when is a good time to test? In text. As early as possible, all the time, every second, after lunch. All of these are excellent answers. Every day, all the time. Yay, I've gotten through to you guys 10 minutes ago, right, Noah? You're not testing early enough. You need to offload your testing into the past. That's how early you need to playtest. So basically, playtest as soon as you can. Run your ideas by people you know. Even if you just have something like a paper prototype, try and bring in others to help test it out, or, hack something together in Unity that you can send to a friend on Discord and just go, okay, do you think this is fun? It's all placeholder, but is it fun? Anytime you make major design changes, you should playtest. So after you add a new level, after you change your HUD, after you change things in response to a previous test, anytime you make a major change, you should be playtesting. Now, obviously, you're not going to have the time or resources to test every single time you change anything. It's not going to be like resize icon, playtest, change text, playtest. Try to gauge when you need to test again, though, especially when you're on a tight timeline, you don't have a lot of resources, aka GDW. If you have a deadline coming up or you're going to be showcasing this build, if you've got a review coming up when you're talking about larger GDW projects later on in the program, you should test before that. If there's anything your team can't agree on and you have 2 different versions of something and you want to know which is better, test to figure out which is better. Actually talk to people, see what works. If you have a few alternatives for what's going on, like a UI design or a control scheme or a power-up that seem equally good, if you have time, implement them all and then test to figure out which is the best. So, who remembers the concept of iterative design from our first lecture? We've talked about it a couple of times now. Big, scary circle diagram with the ideate and the refine and the test and all this other stuff. Basically, we're here right now. Testing is part of iterative design. It is a core part of the cycle, which is why you have to do it over and over and over and over again, early and often. You're not going to see every AAA company doing this. They should be, but they're not. A lot of the time, playtesting gets left into the end of a cycle or after the game's design is almost completely fleshed out. And then they go, oh, well, nobody likes it. It's okay. Just throw in a bunch of cosmetic microtransactions and we'll get people to play by incentivizing them to gamble. It'll be fine, I'm sure. But for your designs as an indie that actually wants to make a good game, you need to make sure that you are testing early and often to refine your design as best you can. So next question, there's a pattern here. You know, we're covering all the journalistic questions here. What can you test? And when talking about what we can test, I would like to briefly introduce a concept that will become much more relevant in upper years and should you decide to do grad school. Don't do it. Get out while you still can. Should you decide to do grad school. Generally speaking, when you run any kind of test or experiment, you should have a purpose in mind. What are you trying to evaluate? What are you trying to figure out? What are you asking by running your test? The question that you're asking by running your test, the question you are investigating, is called your research question. So you can design a playtest which can answer almost any research question, and having a good research question as the basis for your test will help keep you on track. So let's look at a couple quick examples. One example of a research question could be, is the tutorial in this game effective? And shout out to anyone who knows why I put up Cuphead here. I'm not saying that Cuphead's tutorial is bad. All I'm saying is that the experience that that journalist had with it was hilarious. And I don't really blame the journalist, to be honest. He was upfront and honest about saying that this was not at all the genre of game he was used to playing. And say what you will about that little escapade, the developers did actually make some slight changes to the tutorial, the positioning of these prompts and the way things were spaced apart to make it a bit easier for a very, very new player to understand. But it's still pretty hilarious and embarrassing to watch. Another example of a research question, does the combat system feel balanced to players? If you're making a game, for example, that has lots of different options for players to use in combat, say lots of different characters in a hero shooter like Overwatch, does that system feel balanced? Is anyone, Bridget, is anyone overpowered compared to other characters? Does that cause an imbalance issue to the players? Is there anything, Bridget, that will ruin the experience for a lot of people and have them quit playing? In particular, I want to look at kind of a broad class of research questions or a broad class of test designs, if you will, that's referred to as first-time user experience. So the process of starting to play a game when you're a new player and learning the basics is called onboarding or first-time user experience. Onboarding is important. Why? Onboarding is where you learn the necessary skills to keep playing. Onboarding is where you decide if you're going to keep playing the game or if you're going to forget about it because you hate it. It determines whether a player is going to stick with you or whether they're going to bail out because they don't like the core experience. Now, first-time user experience evaluation is an evaluation that is focused on evaluating this process of onboarding. So looking at the first few minutes or the first few levels of a game. And when you do this, basically try to find someone who hasn't played before or doesn't know much about your game at all, ideally, to mimic the experience of someone who, you know, just downloads it because they think the splash art is cool, and figure out if your game is accessible and interesting and teaches everything that players need to know to someone who's just looking at it for the first time. So moving on in our litany of questions to how you actually play test. Well, in general, a round of playtesting will look something like this. First, your team decides on a research question. What are you trying to evaluate? Is it challenge? Is it the tutorial? Is it whether people like the story? Is it a little bit of everything, etc.? The second is designing your test. So when's it going to happen? Where is it going to happen? Who in your team is going to be supervising it? That sort of thing. Next, you conduct the test. You bring in people, you have them play your game, and that's it. You evaluate any data that you collected from people, which we'll look at in a moment. You create a list of issues or changes that need to be made. You discuss these issues among the team, figure out what's actually going to be done, and then you decide on the changes that you're going to make based on this list of issues. Then what do? We implement those fixes, and the whole thing starts again after we've implemented those changes. In particular, given the current situation, I want to talk about testing remotely and what you can do in your GDW groups to still test your games in the absence of being able to bring a bunch of people into the undergrad lab, hand them all a controller that hasn't been washed in 10 years, and say, hey, what do you think of the tutorial? So you can distribute a build of your game and ask for feedback. You don't have to just throw your hands up in the air and say, well, I can't have anybody over, so I guess I'm just going to test with my mom and that is it. It's not to say that your mom can't test. It's just that you should have a variety of people. So stick an executable build of your GDW game in Google Drive. Normally, yes, obviously, you should not trust strangers handing you EXEs, but hopefully you can trust your classmates. And if you can't, maybe send them the source code and say, fine, build it yourself if you think I'm sending you a Trojan. Share it with people who volunteer to test. So trade Google Drive folders with another team, play each other's games, and there you go. Online sessions, you basically have two options. The first, which I would say is probably the best option, is synchronous. So the participant will share their screen with you as they play, for example, through Discord, and then you'll interview them after they play. You'll ask them some questions, talk to them about your experience. Or their experience, rather. You can also have an asynchronous session, so asking participants to play the game on their own time. You can ask them to record their gameplay if possible, ideally using software like OBS, for example, and then you can hand them a questionnaire after their gameplay that says, what did you think of this game? Did you have a problem with it? If you've ever played a game that has a button that you can press to input feedback, like Subnautica, for example, or in Deep Rock Galactic, whenever you stop playing, there's like a little button where you can give feedback. Those are technically asynchronous remote tests in a way. It's getting a little bit of feedback from players after they play the game. And to address something that's just been said in chat, yes, hi there, I totally agree. More games need a feedback button. And please let me know if I'm mispronouncing your name. I think I got it in the first week, but I'm not 100% sure. So getting data from players, that one stage of testing that I said we'd get back to. You need a way to record data from players. What did they do in the game? Where do they have trouble while they're playing? How do you identify all of this? What did they like and dislike? This all relies on being able to collect data from those players about their gameplay. Having a record is necessary to figure out what's working and probably more importantly, what's not working with players' experience. There's lots of different ways to do this. We're just going to look at a few of the main ones that are applicable to you guys, though there's a lot of fancy stuff that you'll be learning about to this end in one of your upper year courses. So observation is a really, really key one. Observation is watching players as they play. The key here is to try not to make players feel as if you're being intrusive. You don't want them to feel like you're judging them or like, you're watching their every move like a hawk. It's important that you understand what's going on, but players still need to feel like they can play naturally. One thing that you can do is encourage players to think out loud while they play. This can be really difficult to do if you're not a streamer, you're not used to kind of talking about what you're thinking about as you play a game, but this can help give you some insight into what players are thinking about, if they can vocalize when they're confused and that sort of thing. Generally speaking, you want to take notes. So, for example, if a player seems to have a problem, if they're taking a long time to solve something or to get through something, try to make a note of it. If you notice them enjoying something, like maybe they're smiling or laughing in response to something, take a note of when they enjoy something and keep that in your back pocket as well. You can follow up on these later when you talk to players and kind of identify what's going on with your game as a result. Again, record gameplay if possible. This is true for both online and in-person tests. Software that I recommend is OBS. It's really helpful for just kind of quickly, capturing everything that's happening in a game. And then later on, you can go back to the recording and kind of skip through and double check what was happening, because you're not going to have a perfect memory, and because you might want to show the participants some of their gameplay and go, how were you feeling in this moment, as an example. So just a couple of pictures here. On the left is, I think this is an old setup in one of the labs we had at the school. Generally speaking, in a fancy playtesting setup, you'll have a whole bunch of researchers clustered around a computer, either watching players live as they play or reviewing gameplay footage. And then on the right there, just a screenshot of OBS if you've used it before. The interface is quite simple. As you can see, it's like no more daunting than Microsoft Word, probably less, to be honest. And with that, you can just record whatever's going on. Questionnaires, another way of getting data from players. So a questionnaire is a form with written or typed questions that all participants answer. Google Forms is likely your best bet for this, whether in person or especially online. Questionnaires are a great way to get data in a uniform format. So you have a bunch of questions that you're asking players. You're maybe giving them multiple choice questions for rating certain things and things like that. They're quick. They're easy to distribute. You can send out 100 questionnaires without it being a huge labor-intensive process, and Google will do all of the work for you in terms of collating the responses. However, with questionnaires, it is difficult to get in-depth answers. You can have long essay questions, but most people aren't going to want to write long essay answers, unfortunate as it is. So kind of take the responses sometimes on questionnaires if it's a really complicated question with a grain of salt. However, questionnaires are great for quick impressions, and they're a good complement for interviewing players. In other words, kind of asking long form questions. You can also ask about the answers that a player gives to a questionnaire in an interview if you have players, say, fill something out and then say, okay, could you expand on why you rated this part of the game as, sad face instead of happy face? So a little example here that I like to show because I find the diagrams hilarious. This is a standardized questionnaire that is actually used quite frequently, maybe not so much in the modern era, but in human-computer interaction research. It's called the self-assessment mannequin, and it's got some pretty cute diagrams of like the weirdest, most uncomfortable smiling faces, and then a measure of excitement, which is apparently literally your internal organs combusting. There's also one for dominance that's just the figure getting gradually bigger and breaking out of the box, which is it's a good time. But this is, generally speaking, you'll have a questionnaire that has some scales, you might have some images, and it captures this data in this very standardized format. Moving on to interviews, and I'm putting this in blue because it's important. This is probably the single most important tool for you as a student in GDW right now or ever as an indie developer. So in an interview, you verbally ask participants about their gameplay. Have a set of questions prepared beforehand for an interview. There's different levels of structure in an interview. There's what's called a structured interview where you ask everyone absolutely the same questions no matter what. What I generally advocate for is something called a semi-structured interview where you might have some follow-ups and you'll let the conversation kind of naturally flow, but you just make sure that every participant will still answer the same basic questions. You make sure that everyone is going to answer your question about the characters and the difficulty in that, and other than that, you kind of let the conversation flow. You'll also want to follow up on noteworthy moments from gameplay and interviews. So remember during your observations when you were taking a note of when players were frustrated or happy or taking a long time to do something, follow up on that and ask them about it. Try to make sure your questions are worded understandably without leading participants to an answer. So don't start an interview with saying, hey, what was the most awesome thing about this game? Why did you like it? Because you're assuming that the player liked the game and that they thought something was awesome about it. Ask something neutral that's like, what was your experience with this game? What was your impression of this game? Did you enjoy your time with this game? Why or why not? That type of thing. So some sample interview questions. One that is a really great thing to ask is to ask players what they had to do in the game. Basically have them explain back to you the premise of your game and what the mechanics are. Having them do this is a great way to figure out if players understand what's going on. If you think the main focus of your game is the gunplay and the first thing out of every participant's mouth is, well, there was these really cool parkour challenges and platforming, then surprise, you've actually made a game that's more focused on parkour and platforming than shooting, and maybe that wasn't your intent, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Getting players to basically parrot back to you what your game is about is a really great way to check understanding and figure out what is happening with your observations. You can also follow up on specific mechanics after this question. So for example, if a player explains something incorrectly, you can ask about their understanding of that mechanic a bit more to understand what happened there and why they don't know what's going on. I'd also always recommend you using the basic trio of opinion questions. So the first, what, if anything, did you like about the game? It doesn't assume that players liked anything, and it's very open-ended and clear in terms of giving players leeway in their response. What, if anything, did you dislike about the game? And then lastly, is there anything you would change about the game? If so, what and how? And this is a way to quickly capture the good things about your game, the bad things about your game, and ideas to improve your game. Really basic questions worded in such a way as to not lead players, a really valuable tool in your toolkit. Something that you'll probably also just generally ask towards the end of an interview is for people to sum up their overall feelings about a game to kind of give you an impression of what the big experience is like. See if you've hit on your design goals or not. So knowing all of this, all of these data collection methods, all of this general testing process, what is a typical play test going to look for you? Well, first, you're going to welcome participants. In the case of a Discord call, thank them for coming out and make sure that they're comfortable and that they have the time and that we can reschedule if this is not convenient for you. All of that kind of pleasantry stuff. Make sure people are comfortable. Participants will generally fill out a form with their name, their age, their past gaming experience. You might keep everything completely anonymous, or you might collect the name if you're going to, say, send them a reward later, if you're going to follow up with them for a second test or something like that. Then they'll play your game. This might be over Discord. This might be just them kind of recording it and then calling you back once they're done, depending on their internet connection. Generally speaking, if you can, have them screen share their gameplay and take notes while they're playing so that you can get as much information as possible. After they're done playing your game, usually you will have a short questionnaire. I usually recommend having like a kind of preliminary questionnaire that just asks for really quick impressions of whether they liked the game and any specific things you want to talk about, like how was the difficulty of the game, that type of thing. Then you'll interview participants. You might reference the questionnaire. You will reference their gameplay. And then after you're done with the interview, you'll thank them. You'll say goodbye. So a few words of advice for running playtests in general before we wrap up. Things you should do during a playtest. Make sure players are comfortable. So players should feel relaxed. They shouldn't be under pressure to play well. Make sure that the players know, tell them explicitly, they're testing the game. You're not testing them. You're not trying to see if they're good and you're going to go, okay, yeah, you're not very good at this game. No, they are helping you test the game. You're here to figure out what's wrong with the game. Make sure that people understand that. Participants should also be able to take a break really easily. They shouldn't feel like they're under pressure to behave a certain way because of you. You want to make sure that you're maintaining a really kind of friendly and professional dynamic where players don't feel like they're under pressure. Encourage them to be honest. So make sure that you're not giving them the impression that if they say something bad about your game, it's the end of the world and you're going to go cry for a year. Take what players say seriously as well. Chances are, if all or most of your playtesters have a problem with something, then your design has something wrong with it. And all or most of your players, when you release your game, are going to have a problem with that thing as well. Don't just go, well, it was a fluke. We tested with 6 people, only 2 people had problems. That means a third of the people you tested with had problems. That's not a fluke. Make sure you're taking what players say seriously. Quick don'ts, what you shouldn't do. Don't make players feel pressured to say nice things. Don't give them the impression that they're going to hurt your feelings if they don't like your game. Make sure they know, this is a professional atmosphere and we're testing the game to figure out what works and what doesn't. It's about the game. It's not about my feelings. It's not about making sure that the tester, is playing well or something like that. Distance yourself from the game too. Don't say something like, this game is my baby. I've been working on this for so long. I'm going to be crushed if this doesn't work out, because that's just going to put pressure on your testers. With classmates, it might be kind of difficult to convey this because everyone knows that GDW is, important to you. So just make sure that you're maintaining a reasonable tone with each other. Don't tell players what to do. So avoid giving hints. It can be kind of tempting if you see someone struggling with something that's supposed to take 30 seconds for, 3 or 4 minutes before they finally get it. But that's an important part of what you're doing in testing your game. You're figuring out how long things take and where players get confused. You want to avoid giving hints wherever possible. You want to see if people can have that correct experience on their own, because you're not going to be there to hold the hand of every player that plays your game. Obviously, there can be an exception to this if the test needs to progress. If someone is stuck on something that should take 30 seconds for 5 minutes and you only have 15 minutes to play, then you can kind of tell players what to do gently just to make sure the test moves on. Note that there's an issue there and then just move on. Most importantly, don't get frustrated with your testers. Don't be a jerk to your testers if they're not figuring something out, or if they maybe have less experience playing games than you thought. Do not get impatient with testers. It's very unprofessional, and it is a really, really it's a terrible thing to do. So some advice specific to GDW. For quality assurance testing, Use source control. So Game Programming Club has probably already done a session on this. Look up GitHub and SourceTree or GitKraken if you have no idea what I'm talking about, and use these as soon as you can for any project that involves code so that your entire team has easy access to your build, easy access to your code, and can see what's going on. If you have absolutely no idea what I am talking about and you don't know who to ask about it, feel free to reach out to me directly. I would be happy to teach you. Test as soon as you have any new feature working or any major change is made to make sure that you're not breaking things. Try to have at least one group member who kind of specializes in QA a little bit. Having someone on the team who's really good at breaking the game, yes, it's going to be frustrating because that person is constantly going to be going, hey, you know, I figured out a new way to crash our game. But they are one of the most valuable people on your team, if not the most valuable. So having someone that can do that is fantastic. For playtesting specifically, try to test with your friends or classmates starting at least 2 weeks in advance of the expo at the end of the semester for your third project, I would say. For your second project, again, try and test in at least 2 weeks in advance of the deadline. It would be great if you can test even way before that, but I get it. It's GDW. It's a really short time frame. So if you can manage 2 weeks before the thing is done, then that would be really good. Iterate quickly. So when you're testing, if you find out that something's a problem, change it absolutely as soon as possible. This should go without saying so that you can improve your design as best you can. That's not to say you should completely change something based on the feedback of just one person, but if you've got a couple of people testing and you're consistently getting that same issue, see if you can make a tweak and move on to improve it. So just a quick recap before we close out. Interface design, the first half of the lecture. Interfaces are what let us communicate with games. So for example, controls allow us to input actions to a game, and a HUD allows the game to communicate with us by showing us information. We learned about some principles for interface design. We talked about visibility and mapping and consistency. We talked about the idea of redundant encoding and feedback and lots of other good stuff. We also talked about the idea of accessibility. So playing empathetically, making sure that you're not creating your game to the exclusion of people that have unique accessibility needs and that sort of thing. Because guess what? Lots of people do, and you don't want people to be locked out of playing your game. With respect to playtesting, test early and often. Wow, where have I heard that before? Could it be every 2 minutes for the past hour? So playtesting, really, really important. Hopefully that advice is useful. If you want to know more about playtesting in general, playtesting in particular is one of my kind of special research focuses outside of this class. So if you want to know a lot more about that, please do let me know. I'll probably also be giving another session on remote playtesting specifically for GDSA at some point in the next month or so. The organization team hasn't gotten back to me about that yet, but I will probably be giving one of those in the next few weeks. So next week is reading week. No class, so I will see you 2 weeks from now. We are going to have an activity which you will have the rest of class to work on. A couple quick kind of announcements / suggestions before then. So outside class for this week, I would say the best thing you can do to kind of reinforce this material and practice with it to make sure you'll apply it well in your GDW projects. Try and pick apart kind of the controls, aka how you communicate with the game, and visual interfaces, so how the game communicates with you, and auditory interfaces as well, obviously, in games that you play. What makes them work? What doesn't? And guess what? If you've never noticed the HUD or the menus or the feedback or the controls in a game, if you've never really noticed them and thought about them, it's probably because that game is doing them pretty well. Interfaces are the type of thing that you don't tend to notice until they get in the way. Unless there's something particularly beautiful or cool or novel about them, a well-designed interface is usually quiet. You don't notice it. You only notice it when something is bad. If I mention Skyrim's inventory, you know, you get the pitchforks out. But if I mention the inventory system in a game that's a little less annoying, like Terraria, you might be like, yeah, it's okay. There's a lot of items in the game, but no big deal. You don't really notice it the same way that you do in Skyrim, and you want to skewer someone. So I have a special request. This is in the slides. There's a survey on Google Forms. It is completely internal, completely informal. It's totally optional. You do not have to fill it out, but we would really appreciate it if you do. We will be using the feedback that we get on this survey to improve the course, not just, the next time we lead this course, if there is a next time, but kind of throughout the rest of the semester to make sure that it's working for everyone in terms of the delivery online, in terms of the material and so forth. If you have a particular complaint or a request about the course, please be open and honest. It is completely anonymous. Your email will not be collected. The only way for us to know who submitted a response is if you write your name in the long text answers that are optional, and don't do that because anonymous feedback is, it's better in resource. So thank you very much to anyone that fills it out. That would be great. So yeah, if you have time, please do fill it out. It'll probably take you about 5 minutes. Bonus announcement. So here in our class next Tuesday during reading week at 6 p.m. So during when we normally have class, we'll have a celebratory reading week games night thing going on. Yes, there will probably be some Among Us. There will be some Jackbox. There might be some Drawful and some other things, Quiplash, TKO, a whole bunch of stuff. So feel free to come out next Tuesday. We'll kick back, play some games and stuff, and that'll be fun. Probably for a couple hours. I don't know how late it'll go, but pop in at any time. It'll just be in the Google Meet. Yeah, it'll just be here in the class. It's not going to be on Twitch. That way we can have voice comms with everyone who's participating. That was kind of a fun start to the semester, so I thought it would be fun to do that over reading week as well. So I'm going to stop talking now so that you have time to do today's activity. Hopefully pretty short, so you should be able to finish it easily in the remainder of what would be the class time. So I want you to pick any game. This is an individual activity. Take 2 different interactions players can have in that game. So things like shooting a weapon or using an ability or rearranging your inventory. I'm very kind of broad in terms of what the definition is of an interaction in this case. Basically anything you can do in the game, or even a small category of things you can do in the game, that's an interaction for the purposes of this exercise. I want you to break down the interface design around that interaction and explain the following, basically like a sentence or 2 for each. So input, what controls or menu interactions or kind of interacting with some type of other interface or something like that is necessary to perform the action? How do you do the thing? Feedback, how does the game show the effect of that action to the players? So what is any associated information on the HUD? Is there an animation that plays? Is there a sound effect? All that kind of jazz. And then accessibility, looking at the input and feedback, how accessible is that interaction? Are there any options for accessibility? Could you foresee someone with a particular need having a problem with that interaction? And then after you do that breakdown, provide a short paragraph, so 4 or 5 sentences, explaining why this design works or doesn't work. You can feel free to include some representative screenshots as well. So I would say that my expectations for this exercise, given the amount of time you have, I probably expect about a page of writing in total, half a page for each. Basically, couple sentences for input, feedback, accessibility, short paragraph after that. And then probably, about a page. Don't spend too much time on it. I mean, you can if you want. Let's do it 11:59. Basically, you have the next 40 minutes to work on it, and that should be enough to get the full mark. So thank you so much for listening. I know today was a super packed lecture. I wish we'd had some more time for discussion and stuff. This was probably the last of the crazy content-packed lectures for a while. We'll be spacing stuff out a bit more after reading week, looking at some cool stuff like level design and narrative. And other than that, I will see you guys next Tuesday if you want to come out to the game session. Failing that, I will see you all on after reading week, and I guess maybe in the tutorial as well if you have questions during that second session this week as well. Okay, Mohit, I see a question in chat there, and everyone is free to go, by the way, if you just want to work on the exercise on your own. Yeah.
Can I send you my activity through Gmail?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, as always, you can feel free to send me anything for feedback. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. And for anyone that's watching this, peace out and great job making it this far.